You're watching KRQE News 13.
It is National Gardening Day, and it's a day to celebrate and recognize, of course, the beauty and the bounty and the benefits of gardening. Well, from the gardens of the Founding Fathers to the gardens of the Spanish missionaries and the ancestral Pueblos here in New Mexico, we are going to be taking a look at gardens across American history. Of course, who better to talk about that than our good friend, historian Raffi Andonian, telling us more about flowers and gardening and everything good in between. Raffi, always good to have you, buddy.
Especially on a beautiful day like this.
Exactly right. You bring so much joy to the studio. You bring a lot of knowledge. Okay, so it's gardening day. How did the Founding Fathers get started with all this?
Well, Founding Fathers are carrying over a tradition that goes back thousands of years or hundreds of years. So real quick to step back, tens of thousands of years, you've had gardening for a long time, mostly for food though. And then in the ancient world, in ancient Egypt and Greece, you have gardening also. They grow things like pomegranate, even vineyards for wine. Pomegranate's my favorite, by the way. I love it. And then what happens, though, what's important to realize when we get to the Founding Fathers, there's decline, actually, for centuries until Queen Elizabeth I, who was queen a little more than 400 years ago, during the time that Virginia was founded, was named after her as a Virgin Queen of England. And so that establishes that tradition of bringing ornamental gardens into England's culture, makes it trendy again, and then over to the colonies. So 150 years after Queen Elizabeth, when you had the founding generation, the idea of what they would call pleasure gardens is well established. Now, they grew food and cash crops too. 90% of the founders, including Thomas Jefferson and George Washington, were farmers. They did that kind of garden that goes back thousands of years. But what they had also inherited was that Queen Elizabeth tradition from 150 years prior to have that pleasure garden that they called, these beautiful ornate gardens. John Custis IV was one of the people that was like really well known. That is George Washington's wife's first husband. He really made it popular, in the founding era. Yeah. One of the best known.
Wow. And you're right. I mean, and I think Queen Elizabeth I had the right idea. It's like, it brings pleasure to the eyes because it's relaxing and it perks up our surroundings.
Just like they say. Yeah,
very
absolutely.
Cool. It also helped America kind of become a little bit more urban as well, right?
Well, after that period, what happens is, of course, going from 90% farming, you have an increasingly urbanizing country in the 19th century. So we're talking 1830s, 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s. And so what that does is it changes the sort of notion of gardens and where they should be. So, for example, whereas cemeteries were places that were not exactly, a beautiful place to be, even in the era of the Founding Fathers, they were just kind of very plain, they change and they become these beautiful places to... as one person put it, we want pleasure gardens in this city too, not just a place for graves. And as you have urbanization and less green space, this is a movement. The other thing that happens during that time is the American Civil War and mass death. More than 600,000 people died, which is almost as much as all of our other wars combined. Well, now there's a public health crisis of what are we going to do with all these bodies? So again, the notion of gardens and cemetery. So all these things come together. Now the notions of death change and they become more glorified. So if death was seen as tragic, now it's seen as glorious. There's even some poetry in the era that really glorifies and even calls death pleasurable. But that then in return affects cemeteries again, where you have these more ornate sort of monuments, if you will, and of course more religious symbols than you did before in this period as well. So gardens start to get interlaced with cemeteries in American cities in the 19th century.
What's funny is you kind of cleared up a lot for us. So like in the booth, we were watching the footage earlier, like, did we just show cemeteries when we're talking about like flowers and life?
Exactly.
But there's the reason why we've been showing you cemeteries for
That's
gardening
right,
in the
and
morning.
people would go there even for an afternoon to picnic there and spend a day at the garden, not just to visit graves. And to this day, for example, Oakland Cemetery in Atlanta, which is some of the photos that you were seeing, people will go there and go running through the park, just an urban park, even if you don't have people buried there.
Okay. That's pretty interesting. I mean, I wouldn't think so, but there you go. Gardening here in New Mexico, I mean, we've had to adapt for our climate and so on and so forth. Right?
That's the big story here, right? So in New Mexico, you have the Pueblo Indian cultures, who, of course, are agrarian peoples. And that means that farming and gardening in some form has been part of the culture and traditions for thousands of years. And the adaptations you see is really about climate here. There's a few that are really fascinating. One of them is what I call diversification. You ever heard of that term in like a financial portfolio? Well, they applied it to farming. What that means is that, for example, they would have little pieces of plots in different areas because it's not always reliable that any one area is going to yield what it's going to give. So, for example, you go higher elevation, you're going to have more water, but you also have a chance of an early frost that can ruin everything. You go lower elevation, you're going to have less chance of frost, but also less water. So you're putting them in different places, hoping that some of them come through. A couple other things that you see is terracing, which they would put plants on different terraces so that they can capture water and reduce erosion. Waffling, which is when they put an imprint on the ground to help capture some of the water. And one of my favorites that's very special to New Mexico is the pumice. They would use pumice stone because this area is very volcanic, especially in and around the Jemez. And that volcanic stone is porous and sponge-like, so it absorbs water. So they would use pumice a lot so that it can absorb and hold the water that they do get. And so this way that allows for the plants to flower later. So that is really what makes all those components together really special in New Mexico. And a great place to see some of that is Bandelier National Monument.
Bet you didn't think you were going to learn that much on a Friday morning, right? When we have Raffi on, that's how it goes. Raffi, where can we find more information?
Here in New Mexico, I would check out Bandelier National Monument. The website for that is nps.gov, as in National Park Service, nps.gov/band, B-A-N-D. That's where I would go.
Raffi Andonian, always a million thanks. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
Yep.